See, while money laundering may be illegal, what we actually have to advocate for, what we actually have to see, is whether or not the art community is directly harmed by it in order for them to warrant then advocating to get rid of it in this system. The fact is this, though, is that when we see that money laundering actually creates benefits for our community, because it creates value in the actual art piece itself, we see it does not warrant it to be completely removed from the system in the first place. Here's what we have to see, is that they are giving you that this false worldview, and basically most of their case starts from this flawed premise. They say that the art community, or rather not the art community, but people who purchase art, see art as simply just a luxury item, and they just see it for their monetary value. But this isn't the case. People still see art for its value and not just for its price tag, not just for how much they sell it or buy it for, they see it for its value in and of itself. How do we know this? Lydia Wittenberger and Isaac both said in their speeches, if someone is willing to pay a certain amount for a product, that means that they see it as worth that much value. Just because some people see it as a luxurious item, does it take away from the fact that people see it as valuable? The further evidence for this was provided by Dworker. We talked about how in the public sector, when people go to museums, they see that art as valuable, and yet they're not the ones assigning a specific money amount to it. So that being said, you can expect two things from this speech, two specific clashes that this debate room comes down to. I think it comes down to enforcement, and it comes down to circulation of the art. Whether or not, I'll break both of those down respectively in regards to how they relate to the art community and to district artists themselves. I want to start with enforcement because it'll give you a clear picture as to how it's going to affect the circulation of art in that second clash. Let's start with the first one, though, of enforcement. Here's the two important things to point out. The first is that there is zero way for them to stop money laundering principally. Now, I know essentially what they're only advocating for is stopping money laundering in the art community itself. But why exactly do they do this? Because they've not very specific harm that money laundering brings to the art community. They just kind of said that they don't want the perception of the art community to be harmed, so they want to kind of cleanse their hands of the money laundering, dispel that, and just don't want it in their community. Right. But the fact is that they don't actually stop that money laundering principally at all. It just incentivizes them to go to other areas. But why does that matter? Because you might be thinking, okay, well, even if they don't necessarily, even if they just stop in the art community, that's still like a net good that just washes out. But the issue that actually happens is that people who really want to launder money just do it in other areas. This is exactly what Tori and Isaac talked about. Now you turn to places like casinos or offshore businesses and whatnot, where now you money launder, except you don't create any value to society. You don't now create art pieces that end up in museums to be appreciated by millions of people. You don't now create art pieces that go to private collections where tons of people can enjoy them in regards to how they fit in. Let me put it this way to you. No matter how the art was created or how it was sold or whatever illegal or shady process was a part of that, it is still an art piece with value, with a vision put into it that people go on to appreciate. So at the very least, we see that money laundering creates value and furthers that purpose of our community. This is actually a direct turn as well. Because what do they tell you owners of the art community is that it's solely based on the value of the piece. And ultimately what we see is that if it's creating more valuable art pieces, if it's creating more ways and more things that people appreciate about art, that literally fulfills their entire goal that they talk about. But the other issue with their enforcement as well, because they don't stop it from going to other areas, but there's an actual issue of enforcement even within the art community. Here's exactly how this would program. He first told you about how it's going to create a massive backlog, right? If you're going to have, as the government, if there's any reason to vote proposition, it's because you want to gain the advantages they talk about. The government would have to oversee every single art transaction that occurs. Now, not only is that just not feasible because people, deal both publicly and privately, but the fact is that they just won't be able to handle that massive burden. It's going to take forever to do all the background checks. It's going to take a massive amount of time. But aside from even the time, the most important thing is the public versus private issue. Yes, maybe you might can regulate it at public auctions, but you won't be able to regulate it if you sell it privately, if you sell it under the table. The government has no way to regulate that. And that is exactly where black market is created. That's where I want to focus my second flash on, is the circulation of art. Here's the most important thing about the art community, is the circulation of those art pieces as they go through collections and museums from the artist's hands starting it in the first place. There's three key areas that affect circulation, and they go back to the three characterizations that Isaac brought up in his first speech. He brought up how the three most important things to the art community are the recognition, specifically for both the artist and the community, then the actual monetary value that the artist gets, and then finally the reputation, making sure that they have clean hands and they're not associated with any scandals, right? Those are the three most important things to the art community. How are those harmed when the circulation of art is harmed? Well, let's look at the perception aspect first. Let's look at how the art community gets clean hands, trying to be free of any scandals, is harmed in Proposition's world. There's a few ways. The first is the reflection on the community. The reflection on the art community is massively tarnished in Proposition's world. Here's exactly how. If you had an industry in which you had to regulate, if the government had to come in and regulate every single transaction, that's inherently suspicious to people. That inherently gives people a negative connotation when they realize that every single time art is bought and sold, that has to be somehow audited and backlogged. That gives people a negative connotation around the art community. That literally points to the fact that there's a black market and that people don't want to be associated with it. But then it also reflects poorly on the artists themselves. Because now, when an artist makes a piece, it's sold to other people, and then maybe down the road it gets money laundered for someone else. Now their piece gets ended up on the black market specifically. Now the artist has to be associated with their piece being used in an illegal way, in an backhand, often illegal way, which ultimately harms their perception as well. No, not at this time. On top of that, what ultimately happens after it's with the black market is that people are using illegal methods, these private deals, which for one are unenforceable, but two reflects poorly in our community as a whole. That's ultimately exactly what happens with the perception. But then the next key idea is the monetary value. These artists who pour a lot of their work into it, who may not even intend their art to be laundered down the road, lose out on either royalties and exposure they get from it now. The first reason is this, is that when the art is now being sold privately, rather than being used as a tax write-off and then donated to a museum, now the artist doesn't receive any royalties for their piece. Think about it this way, if an artist makes a piece, sold to someone else, it's laundered, they still get royalties when it's donated to a museum, like for tax write-offs, that type of thing. They still make money off of it. However, when you specifically look at that now it's being traded privately, when it's traded in the black market, it's no longer being put up in public. The art is no longer being used in museums, etc. That means that artists aren't receiving money for their work down the road. They're not receiving royalties. Furthermore, the art often gets devalued on the black market because there's not high status associated with it anymore, since it's now used in a legal way. And then finally, the art is just less taken care of. Since you don't have the status of being part of the art community, being part of public options, the art is often mishandled, it can be misused in particular ways that ultimately harm the community as well. The final way circulation is harmed, though, is through recognition. There's a few reasons for this. The first is that the artist wants exposure. They want people to view their other pieces, buy their other pieces. However, when their art is now being traded offhandedly in unknown locations and private collections, they don't get any exposure anymore. They get zero recognition. Proposition is no solution for this because they literally can see that eventually people are going to turn to a black market. The current status quo is not a black market because it's still done publicly, it's still done in the eyes of the public. But now that no longer exists. Furthermore, that art is still creating value for people in museums. Regardless of whether it's laundered or not, people are still appreciating it. And that is the main uniqueness of the opposition side, is that you have the uniqueness of the value that is created through money laundering and tax evasion. Thanks so much for your time.